I was staring at an empty space where my 15-ton Snowcat should have been when I realized this HOA dispute was about to become a federal incident. My name is Tyler Peterson, and I'd been operating search and rescue operations in Summit County, Colorado, for the past 8 years. The blizzard that hit our mountain community 3 days ago had dumped nearly 4 feet of snow, with drifts reaching 12 feet in some areas. Roads were impassable, people were stranded, and I had the equipment to help. Or rather, I had it until this morning. I stood in my driveway at 6 in the morning, coffee mug frozen halfway to my lips, staring at the tracks where my Snowcat had been parked. The massive tracked vehicle wasn't something you could just misplace. It was bright red, emblazoned with National Forest Service decals, and weighed more than 3 pickup trucks combined. Yet somehow, it had vanished from my property overnight. My phone buzzed. Emergency dispatch. Another stranded family up on Blackthorn Ridge needed evacuation. A pregnant woman, the message said, possibly in labor. I called dispatch back immediately. "This is Peterson. I've got a problem. Someone stole the Snowcat." "Stolen? Tyler, are you serious? We need you up on Blackthorn now. I'm dead serious. It was in my driveway last night. This morning it's gone. I'm calling the sheriff." I hung up and dialed the Summit County Sheriff's Department. Deputy Martinez answered, sounding exhausted. They'd been pulling double shifts since the storm hit. "Deputy, this is Tyler Peterson. I need to report a stolen vehicle." "My Snowcat, the one leased from the Forest Service for SAR operations." There was a pause. "Your Snowcat, the big red track thing." "That's the one. Hold on." I heard muffled conversation in the background, then Martinez came back on the line. "Tyler, we didn't get any theft reports, but I'm looking at our tow log here. There's an entry from last night. Ironwood Heights HOA called in a commercial vehicle violation. The tow company they contracted with logged a Snowcat removal from 2847 Pinecrest Drive. That's your address." My blood pressure spiked instantly. They towed it during a declared state of emergency. That vehicle is currently the only equipment in the county that can reach stranded residents in the backcountry. I'm just reading what's in the log. Says here it was towed to Mountain Peak, Impound Yard off Highway 9. The HOA president who authorized it was a Brenda Whitmore. Of course it was Brenda. It was always Brenda. I'd moved into the Ironwood Heights development 2 years ago, attracted by the location's proximity to the National Forest and its accessibility for emergency response operations. The HOA had seemed reasonable at first. Monthly dues, some basic rules about lawn maintenance and exterior paint colors. Nothing too intrusive. Then Brenda Whitmore got elected HOA president 18 months ago, and everything changed. She was a 53-year-old former real estate agent who treated the HOA bylaws like scripture and viewed every minor infraction as a personal assault on her vision of suburban perfection. She'd sent me violation notices for leaving my garage door open more than 20 minutes, for having a package sit on my porch for 2 days, and for parking my personal truck at an angle that was apparently 3 degrees off from acceptable. But this was different. This wasn't about aesthetics or property values. This was about public safety during a natural disaster. I threw on my winter gear and started my truck. The drive to Mountain Peak Impound normally took 15 minutes. In current conditions, it took 45 minutes of careful navigation through snow-packed roads. The county plows were running nonstop, but they couldn't keep up with the accumulation. The impound yard was surrounded by a 10-foot chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. The gate was locked, and there was a small office trailer with a dim light visible through the window. I pounded on the door. A man in his 60s opened up, looking annoyed. "We're closed." I'm here for my Snowcat, the one that was wrongfully towed from my property last night. Nothing wrongful about it. HOA authorized the tow. You want it back, you pay the fees. What fees? That vehicle is government property, leased from the National Forest Service for emergency operations. There's a state of emergency declared. People are dying up in the mountains. The man shrugged. Not my problem. I got authorization from the HOA. Documentation is all in order. Tow fee is $800. Storage is $200 per day, plus a $400 commercial vehicle surcharge. That's $1,400. You towed it last night. There shouldn't be any storage fees yet. Storage fees start the moment the vehicle enters the lot. Company policy. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I need that vehicle right now. There's a pregnant woman who might be in labor stranded up on Blackthorn Ridge. I'm the only operator in the county qualified to reach her. Then I suggest you pay the fees. I didn't have $1,400 in my checking account at 6:30 in the morning. I could get it, but it would take time I didn't have. Let me speak to your supervisor. I am the supervisor. I'm also the owner. Name's Chuck Henderson. And before you ask, no, I don't do payment plans. I pulled out my phone and called Deputy Martinez back. The impound lot is refusing to release the Snowcat. They're demanding $1,400 in fees for a vehicle they had no legal right to tow. Tyler, I sympathize, but this is a civil matter between you and the HOA. We can't force a private tow company to release property without a court order. We don't have time for court orders. I've got emergency calls backing up. I understand, but my hands are tied. You'll need to work it out with the HOA or pay the fees. I hung up and stared at Chuck Henderson. If anyone dies because you're holding emergency equipment hostage, I'll make sure you're named in every lawsuit that follows. Are you threatening me? I'm informing you of consequences. There's a difference. I left the impound yard and drove directly to Brenda Whitmore's house. She lived in a large colonial-style home at the end of Maple Grove Court, the most expensive section of Ironwood Heights. Her driveway had been meticulously cleared of snow, creating walls of powder on either side that stood 6 feet high. I rang the doorbell. Once, twice, 3 times. Brenda finally answered, wearing a pink bathrobe and fuzzy slippers. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her expression shifted from annoyed to hostile the moment she recognized me. Mr. Peterson, it's not even 7 in the morning. You had my Snowcat towed. I had an illegally parked commercial vehicle removed from the neighborhood, yes. As is my right and responsibility as HOA president. That vehicle is used for search and rescue operations. We're in the middle of a state of emergency. There are people stranded who need help. Brenda crossed her arms. According to Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the Ironwood Heights HOA bylaws, no commercial vehicles may be parked in residential driveways or streets for longer than 4 hours. Your Snowcat has been parked in your driveway for 3 days. Because there's a blizzard. Because I've been using it to save lives. The bylaws don't include exemptions for weather conditions or personal business activities. Everyone thinks their situation is special. If I make an exception for you, where does it end? Soon everyone will want to park work trucks and trailers and God knows what else in their driveways. Property values will plummet. I fought to keep my voice level. A woman is possibly going into labor on Blackthorn Ridge. She can't get down. The roads are completely impassable. I'm the only person who can reach her. Call 911. That's what emergency services are for. I am emergency services. I'm a certified SAR operator contracted with the county. That Snowcat is leased from the National Forest Service specifically for these operations. Then the Forest Service should have found a proper storage location for it. not a residential driveway in violation of community standards. Release the vehicle, Brenda. Pay the fines. The towing fees plus the HOA violation fine of $500 for the initial infraction. That's $1,900 total. You're charging me a violation fine on top of the towing fees, of course. The violation occurred regardless of the tow. Section 12 is very clear. My phone rang. Dispatch again. Tyler, what's your status? We've got another call coming in. Elderly man with chest pains up on Forest Service Road 247. He can't be reached by ambulance. I turned away from Brenda, still trying to get the equipment released. How long? I don't know. Tyler, these people can't wait. I know. I hung up and faced Brenda again. People are going to die because you decided parking regulations are more important than human lives. Don't be dramatic. The regular emergency services can handle whatever comes up. No, they can't. That's why the county contracted with me. That's why the Forest Service provided the equipment. Normal emergency vehicles can't operate in these conditions. Not my problem, Mr. Peterson. Perhaps you should have considered the community rules before you moved here. I wanted to say a lot of things in that moment. Most of them would have been legally actionable. Instead, I turned and walked back to my truck. I spent the next hour making calls. First to my bank, arranging an emergency withdrawal from savings. Then to the Forest Service district office, which was operating with minimal staff due to the storm. I finally got through to my contact, Ranger Jennifer Harris. Tyler, what's going on? I heard there was an issue with the Snowcat. I explained the situation. Jennifer's response was immediate and furious. They towed federal property? Are you kidding me? I wish I was. It's sitting in an impound lot right now. They want $1,400 to release it. That equipment is on loan to the county for emergency operations under a federal lease agreement. The HOA has no authority to touch it. None. Give me the information on the tow company and the HOA president. I provided the details. Jennifer was quiet for a moment and I could hear typing. Okay, I'm looking at the lease agreement now. The Snowcat is registered as federal property, operated under emergency services provisions. Interfering with federal emergency equipment is a federal offense. I'm calling the U.S. Attorney's Office right now. This is unbelievable. In the meantime, people need help. I'm about to go pull money from my bank to pay the fees just so I can get back to work. Don't do that. The federal government doesn't negotiate with extortionists. I'm making calls. Sit tight. Jennifer, I've got a pregnant woman possibly in labor and an elderly man with chest pains. I can't sit tight. Give me 30 minutes. If I can't get this resolved, pay the fees and we'll reimburse you. But I'm going to make sure this HOA president faces consequences. I waited in my truck in the bank parking lot, watching the clock tick. My phone kept buzzing with updates from dispatch. The pregnant woman's contractions were 10 minutes apart. The elderly man's wife was panicking. A family of 5 was running out of food in a cabin near the wilderness boundary. 28 minutes after I'd hung up with Jennifer, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize with a Washington, D.C. area code. Mr. Peterson. This is Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Brennan. I've been briefed on your situation by the Forest Service. I've contacted the Sheriff's Department and the impound lot. Federal marshals are being dispatched to secure the Snowcat. This should be resolved within the hour. An hour might be too long. I understand. I've also contacted the HOA president. She's been informed that she may face federal charges for interfering with emergency operations and illegally seizing federal property. I've strongly suggested she cooperate immediately. Knowing Brenda, she'll cite some bylaw at you. She did. I explained that federal law supersedes homeowner association regulations. She wasn't pleased, but she's been instructed not to interfere further. 40 minutes later, I was back at the impound lot. This time, 2 U.S. Marshals were with me. Chuck Henderson looked significantly less confident than he had earlier in the morning. "The Snowcat is federal property," one of the marshals explained to Chuck. "It was towed without authorization. You have no legal right to hold it or charge any fees. Release it now." Chuck's face had gone pale. "The HOA gave me authorization." "The HOA had no authority to give. This is federal equipment used in emergency operations. You're going to release it immediately, or you're going to be charged with obstruction." The gate opened. My Snowcat sat in the corner of the lot, looking absurdly large among the regular cars and trucks. I climbed into the cab, fired up the engine, and felt the familiar rumble of the diesel motor. The marshals watched as I drove the massive machine through the gate and onto the road. I headed straight for Blackthorn Ridge. The pregnant woman, Sarah Mitchell, and her husband were staying in a vacation rental that had become a trap when the storm hit. The road up the ridge was completely buried under snow, impassable to anything on wheels. But the Snowcat's tracks bit into the powder like it was nothing. It took me 90 minutes to reach them. Sarah was in active labor, contractions 5 minutes apart. Her husband looked terrified. I loaded them both into the Snowcat's heated passenger compartment and started the careful journey back down. Sarah delivered her baby girl in the emergency room 45 minutes later. Both were healthy. The elderly man with chest pains, Robert Chen, was next. He'd had a heart attack. If I'd been delayed another hour, his wife told me later, he wouldn't have made it. As it was, the paramedics were able to stabilize him for transport to the hospital. I spent the next 3 days running non-stop rescue operations. The Snowcat pulled stranded motorists from ditches, delivered emergency supplies to cut off homes, and evacuated 24 people who couldn't safely shelter in place. The storm finally broke on the 4th day, and road crews were able to start making real progress on clearing the main routes. That's when the federal government's response to the HOA situation really began. I received a call from Assistant U.S. Attorney Brennan a week after the incident. "Mr. Peterson, we're moving forward with charges against Brenda Whitmore and potentially the HOA board. I wanted to keep you informed since you're directly involved." "What kind of charges?" "Interference with federal emergency operations, for starters. That's a serious offense. We're also looking at the financial aspect. The HOA attempted to extort payment for the release of federal property during a declared emergency. Depending on how we frame it, that could include elements of theft, extortion, or fraud. She's going to argue she was just enforcing community rules. She can argue whatever she wants. The law is very clear. You can't interfere with federal emergency operations. You especially can't hold federal property hostage for ransom. The fact that this occurred during a declared state of emergency makes it even worse. People could have died. Some might have if we'd been delayed much longer." "Exactly. That's what makes this case significant. This wasn't a minor administrative dispute. This was a direct threat to public safety." The story hit the local news first, then the state news, then somehow went national. A local woman facing federal charges for having a rescue vehicle towed during a blizzard made for compelling headlines. The comments sections were predictably divided between people outraged at Brenda's actions and people defending HOA enforcement. The Ironwood Heights HOA held an emergency meeting 2 weeks after the incident. I attended, mostly because I wanted to see how Brenda would spin this. The community center was packed. Every seat was filled with people standing along the walls. Brenda sat at the front table with the other 4 board members, looking defiant despite everything. She called the meeting to order and immediately went on the offensive. I want to address the recent media attention surrounding the Snowcat incident. The portrayal of my actions has been grossly inaccurate. I was simply enforcing the bylaws that every resident agreed to when they purchased property in this community. A man in the third row stood up. You had emergency equipment towed during a blizzard. I had an illegally parked commercial vehicle removed according to established community standards. People could have died, a woman shouted. Regular emergency services were available. Mr. Peterson's private business operations are not the responsibility of this HOA. It's not a private business, I said from my position near the back. All heads turned toward me. It's a county-contracted search and rescue operation using federal equipment. You didn't tow my personal vehicle. You towed federal property being used in active emergency operations. Brenda's face flushed. The bylaws make no distinction about ownership. A commercial vehicle is a commercial vehicle. Federal law supersedes HOA bylaws. Every lawyer who's looked at this case has said the same thing. I was acting in the best interests of the community and property values. Another board member, Tom Sinclair, cleared his throat. Brenda, I think we need to discuss this privately. Perhaps we should table this issue and move to other business. Absolutely not. I won't be intimidated by federal overreach and media hysteria. I did nothing wrong. That's when another resident stood up. She was an older woman I recognized from down the street, but whose name I'd never learned. I was one of the people Tyler rescued during the storm. My husband and I were trapped in our cabin with no heat after our generator failed. We're both 78 years old. We wouldn't have survived another night in those conditions. Tyler reached us with that Snowcat when no one else could, and you had it towed. The room erupted in overlapping conversations. Brenda tried to call for order, but the meeting had essentially dissolved into chaos. I left before things got uglier. The HOA's internal politics weren't really my concern. I had bigger worries. The federal case moved forward with surprising speed. Brenda was formally indicted 3 weeks after the incident. The charges included interference with federal emergency operations, attempted extortion of federal property, and obstruction of emergency services. Chuck Henderson, the impound lot owner, was charged as an accessory after federal investigators determined he'd been aware the vehicle was government property, but proceeded with the impound anyway. I was called to testify before a grand jury. The process was straightforward. I explained my role as a SAR operator, the lease agreement with the Forest Service, the emergency conditions during the storm, and the sequence of events when I discovered the Snowcat missing. The assistant U.S. attorney asked, "In your professional opinion, what would have happened if you'd been unable to retrieve the Snowcat that day?" People would have died. Sarah Mitchell might have had complications during childbirth with no medical access. Robert Chen would likely have died from his heart attack before conventional emergency services could have reached him. Several families would have faced severe cold exposure. The Snowcat was the only equipment capable of reaching them in those conditions. And Miss Whitmore was aware of the emergency situation when you spoke with her. I told her directly. I explained about the pregnant woman and the urgent need for the vehicle. She told me to call 911 and that it wasn't her problem. The grand jury returned indictments on all charges. Brenda's attorney immediately filed motions to dismiss, arguing that she'd been acting in her official capacity as HOA president and couldn't be held personally liable for enforcing community rules. The judge rejected those motions in a written opinion that didn't pull punches. The defendant's position as HOA president does not grant her authority to interfere with federal emergency operations or seize federal property. No homeowner association bylaw can override federal law, particularly in matters of public safety. The defendant's actions directly endangered lives during a declared emergency. The charges will proceed to trial. The trial was scheduled for 6 months after the incident. In the meantime, the Ironwood Heights HOA board held another vote. This time, Brenda was removed as president by a 4-1 margin. She voted against her own removal, naturally. The new president, Tom Sinclair, called me a week later. "Tyler, I want to apologize on behalf of the board for what happened. What Brenda did was inexcusable. We're reviewing the bylaws to add explicit exemptions for emergency vehicles and emergency situations. This should never have happened. I appreciate that. We're also going to refund your HOA dues for the next 2 years as a gesture of goodwill. And if there's anything else we can do to make this right, let us know. Just make sure the bylaws are updated. I don't want any other emergency responders in this community facing the same situation." The trial itself was anticlimactic. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution presented the lease agreement showing the Snowcat was federal property, dispatch records showing the active emergency calls, witness testimony from the people I'd rescued, and documentation of Brenda's demands for payment to release the vehicle. Brenda's defense essentially consisted of repeating that she'd been enforcing HOA bylaws. Her attorney tried to paint her as a dedicated community leader who'd made an honest mistake. The prosecution countered by highlighting that she'd been explicitly informed of the emergency situation and had refused to cooperate. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge addressed Brenda directly. "Miss Whitmore, you were given a position of trust within your community. When faced with a genuine emergency, when lives were literally at stake, you chose to prioritize parking regulations over human safety. You were informed of the specific dangers and you dismissed them. Your actions demonstrated a callous disregard for the welfare of others and an alarming lack of judgment." Brenda received 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release. Chuck Henderson got 6 months for his role as an accessory. Both were also ordered to pay restitution to the federal government for the costs associated with the marshal response and investigation. The HOA itself faced consequences too. Several residents filed a class action lawsuit arguing that the board's failure to properly supervise Brenda and prevent her illegal actions constituted a breach of fiduciary duty. That case settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, but I heard the HOA's insurance company paid out significantly. The broader impact rippled through Colorado and beyond. The state legislature passed a law the following year explicitly exempting emergency vehicles and equipment from HOA restrictions during declared emergencies. Similar legislation was introduced in a dozen other states. I testified before the Colorado House Committee on Local Government about the incident. HOAs serve a legitimate purpose in maintaining communities and property values, but they're not sovereign governments. They can't override public safety or federal law. What happened to me could happen to any emergency responder living in an HOA community. We need clear legal protections. The bill passed with strong bipartisan support. The governor signed it into law 3 months later. Life slowly returned to normal in Ironwood Heights. The new HOA board was significantly more reasonable. They updated the bylaws to include emergency exemptions and established a process for residents to request temporary waivers for legitimate needs. Tom Sinclair proved to be a competent president who actually listened to resident concerns instead of treating every minor issue as a crisis. I continued my SAR work. The Snowcat remained parked in my driveway whenever it wasn't in use. Nobody complained. Sarah Mitchell and her husband named their daughter Hope. They sent me a photo on her first birthday. "We wouldn't be here without you," the note said. "Thank you for everything." Robert Chen recovered fully from his heart attack. He stopped by my house a few months after the trial to thank me in person. "I heard what that woman put you through. I'm glad they sent her to prison. What she did was unconscionable." I received a commendation from the Forest Service for my actions during the storm. Jennifer Harris presented it at a small ceremony at the ranger station. "You went above and beyond under extremely difficult circumstances. Your dedication to serving this community exemplifies everything we hope to see in our SAR partners." The local news did a follow-up story a year after the incident. They interviewed me, several of the people I'd rescued, and even got a comment from Tom Sinclair about how the HOA had changed its policies. The reporter asked if I held any resentment toward the community. "No," I said. Brenda Whitmore's actions don't represent Ironwood Heights. The community rallied once they understood what happened. The new board has been great to work with. I'm proud to live here. You think the punishment she received was appropriate? That's not for me to say. The legal system made its decision. What matters to me is that the situation has been resolved, policies have been changed, and hopefully nothing like this will happen again to anyone else. Brenda served 14 months of her sentence before being released to supervised release for good behavior. I saw her once after she got out at a grocery store in town. She saw me too. We made eye contact for a moment. She quickly turned and walked in the other direction. I didn't pursue the interaction. There was nothing to say. The impound lot changed ownership. Chuck Henderson sold it 6 months into his sentence. The new owner immediately implemented policies requiring verification of towing authorization and prohibiting the impounding of government vehicles without explicit written approval from the relevant agency. The blizzard that started this whole mess went down as one of the most significant winter storms in Colorado history. 42 inches of snow in 3 days, with drifts up to 15 feet. 11 people died in Summit County from storm-related causes, but it could have been worse. The after-action reports from emergency services specifically cited the Snowcat operations as crucial to preventing additional casualties. I was invited to speak at a national search and rescue conference the following summer. The topic was legal challenges facing SAR operators in residential communities. The room was packed. "How many of you live in HOA communities?" I asked. About 2/3 of the hands went up. "How many have had issues with your equipment or vehicles?" About half of those hands stayed up. I told my story. I watched heads nod throughout the room. This wasn't a unique problem. It was a widespread issue that most people just hadn't heard about because it usually didn't escalate to the federal level. After my presentation, a woman approached me. She was a paramedic from Arizona. "I got fined $500 last year for parking my ambulance in my driveway overnight during a wildfire evacuation. The HOA said it violated the commercial vehicle restriction. I had to park it a mile away at the fire station and walk home. Did you fight it?" "I paid it." I didn't think I had any recourse. After hearing your story, I'm wondering if I should have pushed back. It depends on the circumstances. But yeah, there might have been options. The Colorado law that passed after my situation could be a model for other states. We talked for another 20 minutes. She left with contact information for several attorneys who specialized in HOA law and had offered to help emergency responders facing similar situations. That became an unexpected side project for me. I started getting calls and emails from SAR operators, firefighters, paramedics, and other emergency responders across the country who were dealing with HOA conflicts. I connected them with resources, shared information about the Colorado law, and occasionally testified in support of similar legislation in other states. 3 years after the Snowcat incident, I was contacted by a documentary filmmaker. They were making a film about HOAs and abuses of power. They wanted to feature my story as a case study. I agreed to participate, though I was careful to emphasize that most HOAs aren't like this. The problem isn't HOAs in general. The problem is when you get someone in a leadership position who lets a tiny amount of power go to their head and loses perspective on what actually matters. Brenda Whitmore became so focused on enforcing rules that she couldn't see the bigger picture. The documentary aired on a streaming service and got considerable attention. It sparked renewed discussions about HOA regulations and the need for oversight. Several states passed or strengthened laws limiting HOA authority and providing appeals processes for residents. I got a letter from Brenda about a year after the documentary aired. She'd completed her supervised release by then and was apparently trying to rebuild her life. The letter was brief. "Mr. Peterson, I've spent a lot of time thinking about what happened. I want you to know I understand now that I was wrong. I let my position and my pride cloud my judgment. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I'm sorry for what I put you through, and for endangering the people you were trying to help. I hope you can accept this apology." Brenda Whitmore. I read the letter twice, then I wrote a brief response. "Miss Whitmore, I appreciate your letter. What's done is done. I hope you found peace and learned from the experience. Best of luck in your future endeavors. Tyler Peterson." I never heard from her again. The Snowcat continued to serve Summit County for another 4 years before the Forest Service replaced it with a newer model. The old one was auctioned off to a ski resort that used it for backcountry grooming. I was a little sad to see it go. That machine and I had been through a lot together. The new Snowcat was bigger and more capable, with better heating and communication systems. It still sat in my driveway when not in use. The HOA never said a word about it. Tom Sinclair served 3 terms as HOA president before stepping down. His replacement was equally reasonable. The community had learned its lesson about empowering people who saw HOA leadership as a platform for petty authority rather than community service. I continued my SAR work, responding to calls throughout Summit County and occasionally assisting in other areas when major incidents required additional resources. The job was demanding, sometimes dangerous, and occasionally heartbreaking when we couldn't reach someone in time. But it was also profoundly meaningful. Every person I helped, every life saved, every family reunited made everything worthwhile, including the federal legal battle and all the stress that came with it. 5 years after the blizzard, I was at a community barbecue in Ironwood Heights when a young girl approached me. She looked about 5 years old with curly brown hair and bright blue eyes. "Are you Mr. Tyler?" she asked. "I am. What's your name?" "Hope Mitchell." "My mom said you saved us during a big snowstorm." Sarah Mitchell appeared behind her daughter, smiling. "I hope she's not bothering you." "Not at all." I knelt down to Hope's level. "Your mom's right. I did help you and your parents during that storm, but you did most of the work. You were in quite a hurry to get here." Hope giggled. Sarah put a hand on her shoulder. "We tell her the story every year on her birthday, how you drove through the blizzard in a giant red machine to help us get to the hospital. She thinks you're a superhero." "Just doing my job." "It was more than that. You fought to do your job when someone tried to stop you. That takes courage." We chatted for a few more minutes before Hope ran off to play with other kids. Sarah thanked me again before following her daughter. I stood there watching the community gather, neighbors talking and laughing, kids playing, the sun setting behind the mountains. This was what it was all about. Not the federal cases or the news coverage or the policy changes, though those mattered. It was about communities where people could live safely, where emergency responders could do their jobs without interference, where common sense and human decency prevailed over petty rule enforcement. The Snowcat incident became a teaching case in HOA management courses and legal ethics classes. It showed up in textbooks and training materials as an example of what happens when procedural compliance becomes disconnected from underlying purpose. Brenda Whitmore's name became shorthand in certain circles for HOA overreach, which I actually found a bit unfair. She'd made terrible decisions, but reducing her to a cautionary tale seemed to miss the larger point. The larger point was that systems need safeguards. HOAs need oversight and accountability. People in positions of authority need to maintain perspective and remember that rules exist to serve communities, not the other way around. I retired from active SAR operations 7 years after the Snowcat incident. The years of hard physical work in extreme conditions had taken their toll on my body. I transitioned to a training and consulting role, teaching new SAR operators and helping agencies develop their programs. The Ironwood Heights HOA threw me a retirement party. Half the neighborhood showed up. Tom Sinclair gave a speech about how I'd represented the best of their community. Several people I'd rescued over the years shared stories. It was more emotional than I'd expected. Sarah Mitchell's family was there. Hope was 7 by then, precocious and funny. "Are you going to miss driving the big red machine?" she asked me. "A little bit, but I'm getting too old to be bouncing around in the mountains all winter." "You're not old." "Thanks, Hope. I appreciate that." As the party wound down, I found myself thinking about how strange the path had been. A towed Snowcat during a blizzard had led to federal charges, legislative changes, a national conversation about HOA authority, and ultimately to this moment, surrounded by neighbors who'd become friends. Looking back, I wouldn't change anything. Not even the stress and anger of those early days when I'd stood in my empty driveway trying to comprehend that someone had towed emergency equipment during a disaster. That moment had sparked a chain of events that made things better for emergency responders across the country. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of orange and pink. I'd lived in Summit County for nearly a decade by then, and the view still took my breath away. This was home. These were my people. And despite everything that had happened, or maybe because of it, I belonged here. The Snowcat incident taught me something important about standing up for what's right even when it's difficult, about the importance of questioning authority when that authority loses touch with common sense, and about how one person's unreasonable actions can ultimately lead to positive systemic change. It also taught me never to underestimate what an HOA president with too much time and too little perspective could accomplish, even if what they accomplished was their own federal conviction. As I drove home from the retirement party, past the houses with their perfectly maintained lawns and coordinated exterior colors, I smiled. The bylaws that governed this place were better now. The people running the HOA understood their role. And somewhere, mounted in the Forest Service District office, there was a photo of me standing next to a bright red Snowcat, a reminder of the time federal law and common sense had to intervene in a homeowner association dispute. I pulled into my driveway, the same spot where the Snowcat used to sit. A younger SAR operator had taken over my role. The newest generation Snowcat sat in his driveway across town. No one had complained about it. no one would dare. The precedent had been set, codified into law, and backed by the full weight of the federal government. Brenda Whitmore had lost her freedom, her reputation, and her position trying to enforce a parking regulation during a blizzard. In doing so, she'd inadvertently made every emergency responder in Colorado, and eventually the country, a little bit safer from HOA overreach. I'd call that justice, even if it came at a steep price for everyone involved. The house was quiet when I stepped inside. Tomorrow, I'd start my new chapter, training the next generation of SAR operators, making sure they understood not just the technical skills, but also their rights, the legal frameworks protecting them, and the importance of standing firm when bureaucracy threatened to interfere with public safety. But tonight, I just sat on my couch, looked out at the mountains, and felt grateful for a community that had ultimately done the right thing, for a legal system that had worked the way it should, and for a career spent helping people when they needed it most. The Snowcat was gone, but its legacy remained, and that, more than anything, made the whole ordeal worthwhile.